The man known to history as King Henry II of England was born on the 5th of March 1133 at Le Mans in Normandy in northern France. His father was Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine, and in that capacity he was the ruler of much of northwestern and central France, particularly those regions to the west of Paris, at a time when France was divided into a number of powerful principalities. Geoffrey was known by the epithet the Handsome or the Fair. Henry's mother was Matilda, known as Empress Matilda. She was the daughter of King Henry I of England and had previously been married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. Matilda's lineage was pivotal for the future of her son's life. Her father, Henry I, was the fourth son of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who in 1066 had crossed to England and conquered the country for the Normans. As a younger son, Henry had not succeeded to any of his father's lands when William died in 1087. But when his older brother, William Rufus, died in 1100, Henry seized the throne of England. In due course, his own son and successor William was in line to succeed him. But in 1120, when Henry was already in his early 50s, William died in a naval accident known as the White Ship Disaster, and the issue of the succession was now thrown wide open. Matilda, as one of Henry's daughters, provided one potential line of succession, although it was generally accepted that a woman could not succeed to the throne at the time. This aside, Henry I concluded as he aged that Matilda would indeed provide his successor through her marriage to her husband Geoffrey. Thus, despite some family quarrels between the king and his daughter and son-in-law, there was a strong claim that the 2-year-old Henry should succeed his grandfather when Henry I died after a brief illness on the 1st of December 1135. However, this would not happen, and the virtual usurpation of the English throne by Henry I's nephew, Stephen of Blois, ushered in a period of civil war which would last for nearly 20 years. This video is sponsored by Magellan TV, a brilliant documentary streaming service covering many different areas of interest, including ancient and modern history, science, the earth and nature, true crime, as well as historical drama. We really enjoyed the series on Magna Carta, and especially the episode called Magna Carta, Immortal Document. This fascinating episode called Magna Carta, the most important document in world history. It suggests it is a symbol of freedom, which we would do well to consider again today, to reaffirm our liberties. Henry II lived in a time just before the advent of Magna Carta. His world was a world without these vital freedoms that Magna Carta introduced. With new content being introduced on a weekly basis, you will never be lost for something to watch with Magellan TV. Plus, there are no advertisements, and you can watch anytime, anywhere, on your TV, laptop, or mobile phone. And with an annual membership costing only $59.88, you pay only $4.99 per month for over 3,500 hours of viewing time. Also, viewers can take advantage of a special holiday offer. Buy one, get one free gift card for an annual membership by clicking on the link in the description. The nearly 2-decade-long period from Henry I's death in 1135 to the eventual full ascent to power of Henry II in 1154 is often referred to as the Anarchy. Stephen of Blois' seizure of power and the aftermath of Henry I's death and the competing claims of the infant Henry driven by his mother Matilda and father Geoffrey ensured that there would be no stable succession. While Stephen was the nephew of William the Conqueror, having been born to the Conqueror's daughter Adela, his accession was not accepted without hesitation by his English and Welsh subjects. It would cause the first stages of a crisis between the English monarchy and the English barons, which would escalate for decades to come, with rebellions arising within Wales and border clashes with Scotland occurring during the course of the 1130s and 1140s. Then, most forcefully, Matilda and Geoffrey began to press their claim and that of their infant son. In 1139, Matilda led a direct invasion of southern England with several key noble allies. While she and Geoffrey and their allies were unable to achieve a complete victory over Stephen at this time, they did secure key footholds in the south of England, and using their bases of support in France, particularly around Anjou, They were able to continue the conflict in such a way that the anarchy would continue for many years to come. Into the 1140s the anarchy continued. As it did, Henry was growing up oblivious to the wars being fought across the English Channel in his name. His first years were spent largely in France, as indeed the vast majority of Henry's life would be. This he shared with many of the early Anglo-Norman kings of England, whose power base lay largely in Normandy and the other French possessions. Later, from the age of 7, he resided at his father's home in Anjou, where he was educated by Peter of Sens, a well-regarded grammarian and scholar of the mid-11th century. But when he was 9 years of age, a more active involvement for the young would-be monarch was decided upon by his parents. He was sent to Bristol, which was one of the principal towns of England in late medieval times, as well as a focus of support for Henry's cause in England in the 1140s. This transfer of Henry to England was at once political and also somewhat dangerous, placing him within reach of Stephen's armies in England, but galvanizing Matilda and Geoffrey's supporters who, for a time, knew that the child on whose behalf they were fighting was in England itself. Here, Henry continued his education for some time before returning to France in 1144, where he received his later education as he entered his teenage years under William of Conches, a scholastic philosopher who was a leading early figure in the Christian humanist movement. By 1147, Henry was taking a more active involvement in affairs. That year, he led a military expedition himself to England from Normandy, the beginning of a period in which he would press his own claims to the throne of England and, in addition, he was also gaining powerful friends. From the late 1140s, King David I of Scotland was a prominent ally, although an attempt to seize the northern capital at York from Stephen's forces failed in 1149. Thereafter, matters in France distracted from a full prosecution of the war in England. The French King Louis VII, who had been absent at the Orient for some time as one of the principal leaders of the Second Crusade, now returned to western France and was immediately troubled by the possibility that Henry would unite Normandy, Anjou, and the family's other French possessions, as well as England, all under his rule. Such a king would be possessed of as great a domain as Louis himself and would actually command greater resources than him. Accordingly, war followed, but a resolution was quickly patched up in 1151 whereby Henry paid homage to Louis as his feudal overlord and provided the French king with a number of small properties belonging to the Duchy of Normandy, the title to which Henry had officially been granted in 1150. When Henry's father, Geoffrey of Anjou, died in September 1151, Henry united the disparate French territories of his mother and father under his own rule, including Normandy, Anjou, and Maine. These extensive properties in the north and northwest of France were soon added to when Henry married in 1152. His bride was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who at 30 years of age was 11 years Henry's senior. She had also been married previously to none other than King Louis VII of France. As the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, a man who died without a son in 1137, Eleanor had ascended as Duchess of the large Duchy of Aquitaine, which extended across a large part of western France. She had married Louis the same year, but by 1152, the union had only produced 2 daughters, and as female successors were excluded in the succession to the French monarchy, neither could succeed Louis. Despairing of an heir, and with Eleanor seemingly having lost interest in their marriage, Louis successfully acquired an annulment in March 1152. Within weeks, the reason for Eleanor's apathy towards Louis was clear to all as she married the young Duke of Normandy just 12 weeks after her marriage ended. Louis was furious at both this insult to his honor and at the fact that Henry now had a claim through his marriage to a further large territory in western France. The fallout from Henry's marriage to Eleanor led briefly to renewed conflict between the young Duke and King Louis in France. Yet this only lasted for a few months, and by 1153, with an unprecedentedly large power base in northern and western France, Henry was in a position to decisively challenge Stephen in England. By that time, nearly 2 decades after the civil strife between Stephen and Henry's supporters had begun, the English king was in control of large parts of the north, east and south of England, including London, while Henry's base lay in the west, particularly around the River Severn Valley. He also had a number of prominent allies, including the powerful northern lord Ranulph of Chester. However, by 1153, when he arrived in England, the war situation was profoundly different to how it had been for so many years. Henry was no longer a child, but was a very powerful French lord in his own right. This, combined with a lack of support from amongst his nobility in England, enjoined the king after a limited campaign to agree a treaty with Henry. Under the terms of the Treaty of Winchester, or the Treaty of Wallingford as it is sometimes referred to, and which was formally signed in 1154, Stephen would remain as King of England, but upon his death, Henry would succeed him. Finally, after 20 years and limited bloodshed in its final stages, the anarchy had come to an end. Henry did not have to wait long for the terms of the Treaty of Winchester to be implemented. In 1154, Stephen was no longer a young man. Exactly how old he was by this time is not 100% clear, but he was at least in his late 50s and possibly in his early 60s at the time, a relatively old age for the 12th century. Stephen might well have viewed the treaty as a temporary expedient, during which time he could regroup and muster support for his son William's cause to succeed him over Henry. But if this was the case, ill health scuppered his plans. Then, in the late autumn of 1154, he fell ill from a serious stomach ailment while in Kent and died shortly afterwards on the 25th of October. Henry, by a rather fortuitous series of events, had gone from being at war with Stephen in early 1153 to succeeding him as King of England just a year and a half later. It was the culmination of a meteoric ascent which had seen Henry acquire vast territories through succession, marriage, diplomacy, and military action between 1150 and 1154. Henry is generally deemed to have been the first of the English kings known as the Plantagenets, although this term was not used to refer to the English royal family until the 15th century, over 300 years after Henry's accession. The Plantagenet designation divides Henry and his successors from the kings of England who ruled from William the Conqueror in 1066 through to Henry's own accession and lasts up to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses in the 15th century. The term Plantagenet is something of a lingual construct rather than being a family name in and of itself. It derives from a nickname which Henry's father Geoffrey, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy, was given during his lifetime in recognition of a bright yellow flowering plant which he used to wear as a symbol of his house. The name Plantagenet is derived from this, as the Latin for the same common broom plant is Plantagenista, which subsequently, through common usage, became the French term plante geneste, and was then further anglicized as Plantagenet. As a result, the dynasty of English kings which held the throne from Henry's eventual accession in 1154 through to the advent of the Tudors in 1485 is known as the Plantagenets. Upon his succession, Henry became the ruler of what has become known as the Angevin Empire, or the possessions of the Angevin kings of England. This empire would be held by himself and 2 of his sons. This imperial designation was granted to Henry's dominions as an acknowledgement of both the extent of the territories he ruled as well as their cosmopolitan nature. By the time he ascended to the throne in 1154, Henry ruled all of England and virtually the entirety of northern and western France, including the Duchy of Normandy, the County of Anjou, from which the Angevin imperial title was derived, the Duchy of Aquitaine, by right of his wife, as well as extensive territories in Maine and Gascony in France. The English crown had virtually secured control over Wales as well by this time, a process which had started under William the Conqueror nearly a century earlier, while England's long history of involvement in Scotland ensured that Henry had a certain amount of influence here also. This, combined with a role within Brittany in northwest France, through a marriage arrangement in the 1180s, as well as the rapid conquest of much of Ireland in the early 1170s, ensured that by the middle years of his reign, Henry II was the ruler of a vast empire for its time, one which stretched from Dublin to London and south as far as the Pyrenees. Just who was the new king of this vast expanse of territory in Western Europe? To begin with, his name itself was somewhat ambiguous. In the late medieval period, individuals were very often referred to by a place with which they were associated or a sobriquet. For instance, the first Anglo-Norman king of England had been William of Normandy, prior to his conquest of England, and subsequently became known as William the Conqueror. And, as we have seen, subsequent generations would come to refer to Henry and the royal family which he created as the Plantagenet. But at the time, and indeed in chronicles and government records for hundreds of years to come, he was more usually referred to by the quite unusual name of Henry Fitz-Empress. This was in honor of the fact that Henry's claim to the throne and that of his successors descended by right of his being the son of the Empress Matilda. Furthermore, unlike some of his predecessors, we have a clear idea of what Henry Fitz-Empress looked like. He was of an average height, but was clearly a well-built individual with a large chest, albeit somewhat stooped as the years went by, a not uncommon development for individuals who spent long periods of their life on horseback. He had blue-grey eyes and reddish hair which he kept short. By temperament, the new king was said to be at once gentle and friendly to those within his inner circle, while also being possessed of a fiery and even explosive temper, one which he often employed to get his way when he met with resistance from his advisors and senior nobility. He was also an extremely energetic individual, one who rarely rested in the same place for prolonged periods of time at ease, as many other monarchs of his own day and later would do. Indeed, one of his common traits was his preference for standing at court rather than sitting. Moreover, his leisure time was often spent hunting and hawking. However, Henry also possessed a sense of humor, as at court he procured the services of a flatulist, Roland the Farter, who would perform one jump, one whistle, and one fart for the king, and it is recorded that he was rewarded with the manor house at Hemmingstone in Suffolk for his services, along with 30 acres of land. But, as well as this, Henry was also possessed of an intellect. He was well-read, could engage in debate with scholars, and would have travelled across much of Europe without the need for interpreters. Such was the breadth of languages he spoke. Furthermore, chroniclers of the times attest to his loyalty towards those who were equally loyal to him, but that he displayed unwavering resentment against those whom he felt had betrayed him. In time, this latter trait would create enormous difficulties for his rule and tarnish the legacy of what was otherwise a highly successful reign. Whilst Henry had finally secured the throne after years of struggling with Stephen and brought the political anarchy which had subsumed England to an end, Henry's reign was quickly confronted by a fresh challenge, and it came from his own brother Geoffrey. In December 1155, Geoffrey initiated a revolt in France, calling for parts of the family's French possessions to be handed over to him, now that Henry had assumed power in England, specifically the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. An extensive family conference in France in February 1156 failed to resolve the conflict. But, within months, without any major military action, Henry managed to crush his brother's ambitions, in part by making Geoffrey the new Count of Nantes. And in the end, the challenge proved beneficial to Henry's cementing of his rule. He used the opportunity presented by Geoffrey's revolt to crush the independence of some of those French knights and nobles under his dominions who had sided with Geoffrey, and when Geoffrey himself died in 1158, the time proved opportune to fully cement Henry's control over his French possessions. Now, Henry would have unequivocal control of the growing Angevin Empire, a hegemony which would not be challenged for nearly 20 years. In part, Henry's success came about because of his own boundless energy combined with a shrewd pragmatism. The young king knew what was achievable and worked to implement it. But his accomplishments in bringing stability to England and France after so many years of turmoil must also be attributed to the intelligence with which he selected his advisors. Significant amongst them was his mother, Matilda, who had done so much to champion Henry's cause in his youth, at a time when he barely knew what it was that was being fought over. She worked extensively with the church and patronized the Cistercian reform movement throughout the 1150s and 1160s until her own death in 1167. Other close advisors included Henry's uncle Reginald of Cornwall, the Earl of Arundel, William d'Aubigny, and the justiciars Robert Earl of Leicester and Richard de Lucy. Several senior bishops were also brought into the administration, but no figure was as ubiquitous and influential in the young king's government than the man he made Lord Chancellor of England, Thomas Becket. A protege of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Bec, Becket was recommended to Henry in the mid-1150s and quickly became an indispensable part of his regime, increasing Henry's revenues throughout England. What each of these advisors offered was experience in administration, which the young Henry otherwise lacked. These years would also see the almost continuous growth of Henry's family, and eventually Henry and Eleanor would have 8 children in total. Surprisingly, in a time of high infant mortality, all but one of the 8 survived infancy, and by 1170, their surviving 4 sons and 3 daughters ranged in age from 15 years old to just 3 years old. The elder daughters, Matilda and Eleanor, were married to the Duke of Saxony named Henry the Lion and Alfonso the King of Castile respectively, while the third daughter was Joanna. The eldest son was Henry's namesake, who was married to Margaret, the daughter of the King of France, Louis VII. Henry Jr.'s younger brothers were Richard, Geoffrey, and John, 2 of whom, even as younger sons of the king, would eventually go on to have extremely consequential lives and careers in their own right. Richard, not least as a king, and the Lionheart, who would battle with Saladin in the sands of the Holy Land on the Third Crusade, and John as a future king of England, whose famous clash with his barons and nobles of the early 13th century would result in the fashioning of the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Henry's relationship with his sons would soon come to dominate the latter half of his reign. Although he was very often distant from his English dominions, Henry II took a decidedly strong interest in the administration of his kingdom and the oversight of the courts there. For instance, he initiated a series of inquests and issued many royal edicts, which led to the development of a more coherent and centralized bureaucracy. For instance, an ordinance of 1170 brought local officials such as sheriffs and major local landholders under greater royal scrutiny and made it clear that wide-scale corruption would no longer be tolerated, even if Henry was absent in France or elsewhere. And other regulations standardized some specific elements of oversight. For instance, the Assize of the Forest Act of 1184 brought the regulation of forests and the taking of wood from the same into a formal and standardized form of royal control. Other extremely important laws in this regard provided new prohibitions around the ability of landlords to simply eject tenants from their lands, and around how freeholds could be created and maintained. These new regulations also evolved the system which allowed 12 knights to adjudicate on disputes at the local level, which eventually would lead to the development of the modern jury system. In terms of taxation, Henry increased the rates payable based on a knight's service from as early as 1166, based on a document known as the Cartae Baronum, or the baronial chart. This was the first countrywide listing of dues which were owed to the crown by knights and was used by Henry's exchequer officials to increase the potential yield from military taxation. Some of these taxes were gradually increased during the course of the 1180s to pay for exchequer increases which were necessary to support the Crusades to the Holy Land as the Muslim Lord Saladin was threatening to recapture Jerusalem and the Crusader states there. Ultimately, Henry's administrative reforms are most clearly defined by the uniformity which he lent to the kingdom's courts and taxation. In the early 12th century, a series of competing judicial systems still existed in England, in large part owing to the overlapping Anglo-Saxon, Norman, and Viking traditions in use across the kingdom, but by the end of Henry's reign, a much greater degree of uniformity had been lent to the system of administration. In the end, Henry II's managerial policies were leading to a situation at the local level where a system had been created, which one historian has defined as a species of self-government at the king's command, meaning that local courts and administrators could govern themselves as long as they gave ultimate authority to the king. Henry was, perhaps above all else, an innovator as a king of England, in contrast to William the Conqueror and his immediate successors, in that Henry understood how to manifest and display the royal power which he had attained. In an effort to impress his contemporaries, he employed numerous building programs and other measures, which in more modern times would be referred to as acts of propaganda. For instance, Henry had a great leper house, or Lazarus, constructed in Caen in France in the early 1160s, whilst there were many other royal building projects underway throughout Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Maine, and England, which commanded the enormous respect of contemporaries. Such was their grandeur. These displays of wealth and power were intended to convey an aura of strength and prosperity, and were designed to indicate that a strong monarchy had returned after the years of anarchy which preceded Henry's full accession. And Henry was well attuned to the statement architecture could make. An enormous keep was built above the cliffs of Dover, which greeted so many visitors to England as they sailed to Kent from northern France. This building program also extended into the ecclesiastical sphere, Henry acting as a patron of a great many impressive church establishments, both in France and in England. All of this served to cement and aggrandize Henry's rule, something which was much needed in the aftermath of the anarchy of Stephen's reign. Having secured his rule during the course of the 1150s and introduced a number of highly effective reforms to consolidate his grip on the Angevin Empire in the years that followed, Henry might have looked forward to a more sanguine, peaceful time in the 1160s, one in which he could enjoy the fruits of his earlier accomplishments. However, it was not to be so. The 1160s were largely defined in Henry II's reign by conflict, and it came from the strangest of places. We have already seen that one of the individuals in whose hands Henry placed great power in the first years of his reign was Thomas Becket, whom he made Lord Chancellor of England. This patronage of Becket reached its height in 1162 when, following the opening of a vacancy in the position, he promoted Becket to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. As Archbishop, Becket was the senior ecclesiastical officer in all of England and was theoretically answerable only to the Pope in Rome in the management of many church affairs. Henry's reasoning for this promotion was clear. He wanted an individual who would do his bidding as Archbishop, yet it would prove to be one of his few bad moves. A year later, in the summer of 1163, at a major conference held at Woodstock, Becket first quarrelled with Henry by attacking the king's effort to turn an annual payment which was paid to sheriffs by the church into a form of royal revenue. This was an extraordinary clash, vitriolic in its anger, during the course of which Henry turned in fury on the archbishop and stated that, "By the eyes of God it shall be given as a revenue and entered in the royal rolls." To which Becket responded that, "By the reverence of the eyes by which you have sworn, my lord king, there shall be given from all my land, or from the property of the church, not a penny." It was just the first step in an increasingly intense rivalry between the king and England's most senior religious figure. This was all very different to what Henry had expected in 1162 when he promoted Becket. He expected a compliant senior cleric who would act in unison with him as king. The conflict would drag on for the remainder of the 1160s and eventually formed one of the most turbulent and controversial aspects of Henry's reign, one which is still widely remembered and written about today, over 800 years later. Soon after the initial clash between the pair at the Council of Woodstock, the king and the archbishop quarrelled yet again over the issue of Becket's right to excommunicate tenants-in-chief on the church's vast lands throughout England, without first seeking out royal approval. Henry, perceiving Becket's behavior in this respect to be a breach of his royal position, began to pressurize the bishops of England to acknowledge his superior authority over such matters compared to that of Becket as primate of the English Church. These clashes culminated in the constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, where Henry presided over a synod which sought to reduce clerical independence. Ultimately, it was no surprise when Becket resisted any efforts by Henry to weaken the church's jurisdiction and rights, and Henry responded by stripping Becket of several large estates which Becket held by right of his previous role as Lord Chancellor of England. A tit-for-tat exchange followed throughout the mid-1160s, with Becket trying with some considerable success to interfere in Henry's marriage arrangements for his wider family, an issue which the Archbishop of Canterbury had some significant jurisdiction over, and Henry, for his part, taking over Becket's personal residence at Berkhamsted and using it henceforth as a royal Christmas retreat. Thereafter, as things ratcheted up in the mid-1160s, the struggle between the pair became increasingly personal. Some distance was maintained between the pair following the Constitution of Clarendon and the various scuffles of the mid-1160s, but the ultimate conflict was simply being delayed largely by Pope Alexander III, who was himself an exile in France owing to political strife in mainland Europe, involving the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, and who had advised Becket to keep his distance from Henry. Nor was the king inclined to let the matter go, and so from 1164 onwards he attempted to break Becket's political resistance by imposing a series of highly punitive financial fines on the archbishop, some of which concerned his previous exercising of the office of the Lord Chancellor of England, and which culminated in the charging of an obscene bill of £30,000 against Becket, the equivalent of tens of millions of pounds in today's money. Rather than accept such measures, Becket entered into outright opposition to Henry, fleeing to Flanders in the Low Countries or modern-day Belgium. Now, the pair would not see each other directly again for 5 years, Becket variously spending time in Flanders and at the papal court of Pope Alexander III in exile during the late 1160s. It is difficult to know on whom the majority of the blame for what had already occurred and what subsequently occurred should be placed. Henry was certainly an autocratic monarch, but Becket was also a cleric who thrived on being at the heart of political intrigue. Moreover, the archbishop liked the fact that he was the center of much of Europe's political correspondence as the King of England fought with his senior ecclesiastical official. Henry, for his part, hated this need for celebrity in Becket, and yet a rapprochement was eventually reached in July of 1170, as the leading monarchs of Western Europe and the Pope intervened to make the King of England and the Archbishop of Canterbury see eye to eye. It was, ultimately, an ephemeral peace. When Becket landed in Kent in the south of England on the 1st of December 1170, after 5 years in exile on the continent, he cannot have expected what would happen. Disputes over land yet again arose, and within days it was clear that Henry desired to be rid of Becket once and for all. 4 knights, who were followers of Henry from northern France, duly took up the charge. On the afternoon of the 29th of December 1170, they entered Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the archbishop within the church. The clash had residual consequences for Henry. The conflict between the Church and the King of England intensified, and Pope Alexander III quickly had Becket canonized in 1173, one of the swiftest acts of bestowing sainthood ever undertaken by the Roman Catholic Church. Yet, Henry tried his level best to separate himself from the murder, which he did not orchestrate directly, with a diplomatic drive amongst the monarchs of Western Europe. Ultimately, Henry feared his excommunication by the Pope, whereby he, even as one of Europe's leading monarchs, would be officially excluded from taking the sacraments and receiving the services of the Catholic Church. Although a general rapprochement was worked out between Henry and the Pope in the course of 1172 and 1173, it was a chastening experience. Overall, the clash with Becket must be remembered as one of the least successful and dire aspects of Henry's reign. He had sought to increase his control over the church, particularly its land and wealth, and succeeded in little other than creating a church and state crisis, which dragged on for an entire decade. Yet, it was a significant moment in English ecclesiastical affairs, one which foreshadowed the more significant rupture which occurred over 3 centuries later during the reign of Henry VIII. While the clash with Becket generally dominated the 1160s and early 1170s for Henry, another major aspect of his reign was playing out during these years, one which would have enduring consequences for England and Britain down to the present day. This involved the island to the west. Ireland had never been conquered by the Romans, and it remained largely aloof from Britain too during the early Middle Ages, although it too had experienced various Viking encroachments from the late 8th century onwards. Nevertheless, by the mid-12th century, it was still a land largely made up of competing Irish kingdoms controlling different parts of the country, such as the provinces of Leinster and Connacht. Yet this rivalry between small kingdoms was about to have an enormous bearing on England's involvement with Ireland as, in 1166, the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurchada, pressed a claim to the High Kingship of Ireland, and when this was successfully resisted by Rory O'Connor, the King of Connacht, Dermot petitioned for outside help from Henry II. Although Henry did not directly offer aid, he did allow some of his subjects, particularly those in Wales, to consider aiding Dermot. This was to be the beginning of much strife in Ireland. In 1169, one of the major Cambro-Norman lords of Wales, Richard Fitzgilbert or Richard de Clare, who was also known as Strongbow, and who had succeeded in 1148 as Earl of Pembroke in Wales, was successfully solicited by Dermot to undertake a military incursion into Ireland to ally with Dermot against his Irish enemies. In a bewilderingly quick military campaign between 1169 and 1171, when Strongbow and his allies, beginning with Robert Fitzstephen, first began arriving in Ireland, they succeeded in conquering large swathes of the country. For instance, Waterford was quickly seized by Strongbow upon his first landing in the south of the country in the early autumn of 1170, and he then moved on to capture Dublin itself. As a result, Dermot was able to consolidate his position within Ireland and was soon challenging his rivals in Connacht and the broader west of the country, as the Cambro-Normans in the south and east of the country were consolidating their position, one which would not diminish in one form or another for over 700 years. Moreover, Dermot's death in 1171 removed him as the driving force behind Strongbow's invasion and created a situation in which de Clare and his allies could begin to carve out their own principalities and act upon their own initiatives. All of this quickly agitated Henry, who now perceived de Clare as becoming a potential threat as an over-mighty subject across the sea in Ireland. Accordingly, he mounted his own expedition to Ireland in the autumn of 1171, as Rory O'Connor was himself attempting to strike back against Strongbow and his allies around Dublin and Waterford. In the months that followed, Henry II succeeded in firstly asserting his control over Strongbow and his other subjects in Ireland, who may have begun to view themselves as lying outside of his jurisdiction in Britain, while also receiving the submission of a very large number of the more powerful regional Irish rulers and kings. Ultimately, this campaign of Henry's between the autumn of 1171 and the late spring of 1172 transformed the nature of the English intervention in Ireland. What was originally a campaign by some opportunistic mercenaries led by Strongbow became a concerted political intervention in Ireland by the English crown. Although Henry quickly left Ireland in 1172, 3 years later the Treaty of Windsor was negotiated with the Irish lords, which effectively acknowledged the English crown as the ruler of Leinster, Meath, Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford. As time went by, this rule extended further north to incorporate East Ulster, leaving the English crown in control of over half of Ireland and cementing its role there for centuries to come. While the Irish conquest must be viewed as a huge success for Henry's reign, at least from the Anglo-Norman perspective, if not from that of the Irish, it was soon followed by further turbulence within Henry's wider dominions. This fresh unrest, following quickly upon the near-decade-long controversy surrounding Becket, must have stung Henry even more than the perceived betrayal of the man he had promoted to Lord Chancellor and then Archbishop of Canterbury. It came from within the king's own family. As we have seen, Henry and Eleanor's union had produced many children by the end of the 1160s. It was customary in Western Europe in the 12th century that a ruler who held such extensive territories as Henry did would begin to hand over control of some of these to his sons as they came of age. Henry himself had been granted the Duchy of Normandy by his father while he was still a teenager. Now the king's eldest surviving son and namesake, typically called Henry the Young King, having turned 17 in 1172, began to grow restless at his father's failure to devolve some power to him, despite naming him as his legal heir in 1170. The young Henry was encouraged in this resentment by two sources. One was his father-in-law Henry II's on-off nemesis, King Louis VII of France, whose daughter Margaret the young Henry had married. The other was, shockingly, his own mother and King Henry's wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine. This unrest soon turned into outright plotting and then civil war, one which would come to dominate much of the mid-1170s throughout the Angevin Empire. During it, Henry's consummate abilities as a tactician and diplomat were yet again on display. Before he was fully aware of what the young Henry, Eleanor, and King Louis were even plotting, a massive alliance had been formed against him, which included the Kingdom of Scotland and the powerful counts of Boulogne, Flanders, Dreux, and Blois in France, and the Low Countries. Moreover, to add insult to injury, Eleanor had succeeded in drawing King Henry's other sons, including Richard the Lionheart, who was also of a substantial age like young Henry, into the conspiracy. But despite this array of enemies, King Henry pulled through. The Count of Boulogne was knocked out of the conflict when he was killed by a crossbow bolt in the summer of 1173, while this also effectively removed the Count of Flanders, the Count of Boulogne's brother, from the war. Similarly, the back of the rebellion was broken in Britain when King William I of Scotland was captured at the Battle of Alnwick in Northumberland in July 1174. Henry studiously stayed away from these conflicts and oversaw events from afar, allowing his enemies to damage their own efforts through overt involvement. But surely the most significant moment in the war came when Eleanor was captured as she was traveling to Paris from Poitou, and this, combined with the military defeats of their allies, forced the young Henry and his brothers to concede to their father in 1174. Yet, despite the victory of Henry Fitz-Empress over his family, many of the familial problems which had brought about the rebellion would remain and continued to fester in the years that followed. Henry never forgave Eleanor, and in 1175 he sought to obtain an annulment of their marriage from the papacy, a move which was protested vigorously against by his sons Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey, and which was in any event blocked by Pope Alexander III. Nevertheless, it was a clear indication of how precarious the familial situation was in the aftermath of the Civil War of the mid-1170s, and more tangibly, Eleanor was kept effectively under imprisonment by Henry in the years that followed, although his sons were given more leeway. For instance, Richard was given some authority over the Duchy of Aquitaine after 1174, and when Geoffrey married Constance of Brittany and effectively brought that duchy in northwest France into the Angevin sphere of influence in 1181, he too was afforded some control over the region. The young Henry, though, as the leader of the rebellion, was never truly forgiven. When he died prematurely in 1183 in his late 20s, he had not been given control of any major territory. While the period from 1173 through to the young Henry's death a decade later had been largely characterized by instability during King Henry's reign, primarily wrought by his own family, the death of the king's heir opened up a period of full-blown political crisis. In part, this was driven by conflict between the sons themselves, each of whom had ambitions to succeed to various parts of the Angevin Empire and could benefit at the expense of the others. This tension became more extreme with the death of the young Henry in 1183. Now, Richard was King Henry's heir, but the question remained as to what territories would pass to him and which would be cut off from the wider Angevin inheritance and granted to Geoffrey and John. And, as ever, the court at Paris looked on, waiting to see what would happen. In 1180, Louis VII was succeeded by his son Philip II, or Philip Augustus as he was more commonly known, and it was in this new monarch's best interest to ensure the Angevin inheritance was split amongst Henry's sons, a move which would weaken them compared to his own power base in central and eastern France, although in this respect, Philip's aims were hampered in August 1186 when Geoffrey was killed in a jousting accident. There were now just two sons, Richard and John, amongst whom Henry could split his dominions. The result of Geoffrey's death was war between Henry and Philip Augustus, one which would prove the last significant military and political engagement of his life. He hired large numbers of Welsh mercenaries, the very kind who had driven the conquest of Ireland nearly 20 years earlier, to launch a campaign into France in the course of 1187, aided in this instance by the Counts of Flanders and Blois, the enemies of an earlier time. However, now he was joined in his efforts by Richard and John as the burgeoning Plantagenet dynasty showed some rare unity in the face of this act of overt aggression by the French king. Then, a meeting between the two kings in April 1187 failed to reach a compromise and, in the summer, lengthy clashes occurred in central France around the region of Berry. The resulting engagements were sporadic. For 2 weeks, the opposing armies skirted next to each other around the river Indre, while diplomatic efforts to avoid a full-pitched battle continued. It is a remarkable feature of this time the degree to which Henry and the French kings attempted to avoid major engagements, which would fully resolve their conflicts, and then, yet again before a major conflagration occurred, a temporary peace was patched up. Again, the diplomatic armchairs seem to have shifted, and Henry's son Richard had apparently intervened with the French king. While the conflict had temporarily abated, the succession issue still remained unresolved. But what would come to be the last months of Henry's reign, in 1188 and 1189, lent a final degree of resolution to it. When the French king Philip yet again invaded Berry, a renewed unity was achieved between Henry and his eldest surviving son, Richard. The fighting brought Henry himself out of England and into France with renewed forces of English and Welsh troops. War erupted all along the frontier between Philip's French dominions and those of the extended Angevin Empire in northern and western France. Large settlements were attacked and largely destroyed. Eventually, a temporary peace was finally patched up in the early winter of 1188, when the ever-powerful and influential Counts of Blois and Flanders refused to engage any further in the hostilities which pertained in France. Details of a peace were worked out in the weeks that followed, and marriage negotiations between Richard and Philip's royal family were further brought under consideration. These negotiations would still be underway when Henry's life entered its final chapter. A parley occurred between the respective sides in May 1189, but behind the scenes, King Henry was preparing for renewed war with the French. As ever, extensive mercenary units from Wales had been recruited. At the end of the parley, fighting broke out again, but Henry was unable to prosecute the war which followed. His health had been failing for some time, the result of a severe ulcer. diminished physically and perhaps worn out psychologically owing to the continuous conflicts with his family members, so many of whom had predeceased him, Henry appeared at a final conference with Philip, with whom Richard was now unequivocally allied, in July 1189. At this meeting, Henry was visibly ill. As a result, he agreed to some conciliatory terms, but was said by a contemporary chronicler, Gerald of Wales, to have defiantly whispered in his eldest surviving son's ear, "God grant that I may not die until I have my revenge on you." If he did say this, and the account may be spurious, he would never live to see that wish fulfilled. 2 days later, Henry II, the man who had ruled England for 35 years and had created the Angevin Empire, died at the age of 56. Just hours before he collapsed into a final fever, he learned that his other son, John, had joined Richard's new rebellion. As a result, many chroniclers and scholars have judged that this final act of betrayal had all proved too much after years and years of family strife. He was buried in the Abbey of Fontevraud in the county of Anjou. Despite the massive difficulties which had arisen in Henry's family relations throughout the 1170s and the 1180s, the succession to his rule would not prove as fraught as had been that which followed the death of Henry I, over a century earlier, with its nearly 20 years of anarchy before Henry's own accession in 1154. But the succession in 1189 was complicated nonetheless. Henry's eldest surviving son, Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, as he is more commonly known, had already taken the Crusaders' cross in France in 1187 and committed himself to traveling to the Holy Land to try to secure Jerusalem from the great Arab lord Saladin, who would eventually reconquer the city that year, after nearly a century of it being in Christian hands. Although he was still in Western Europe when his father died, and was duly crowned as King of England at Westminster on the 3rd of September 1189, 2 months after his father's death, he soon set off for the Holy Land in January 1190. He would not return for several years, and, in the interim, his younger brother, John, assumed a great degree of authority in England. It was the beginning of a period of renewed unrest within England, one which worsened after John succeeded Richard in his own right in 1199, and which culminated in a major baronial revolt in England, the First Barons' War, in 1212. Consequently, the political consensus which Henry II managed to create for much of his reign quickly broke down following his death. Henry II must surely have a place amongst the English kings who are most difficult to decipher. There is little doubting his achievements. For instance, the very act of his accession and consolidation of power ended a period of nearly 20 years during which England and its French possessions had been racked by political anarchy owing to the insecure succession to King Henry I. By way of contrast, Henry II not only secured his ascent to power in his youth, but consolidated his power in such a way as to set England on the path to becoming the most centralized state in late medieval Europe. Beyond this, his marriage to Eleanor and his intervention in Ireland created the so-called Angevin Empire, a political entity which spanned England, Wales, substantial parts of Ireland, and much of France, including Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. All of this is a formidable achievement, but against it must be considered the failings of his rule, notably his inability to control the ambitions of his children and even his own wife. As a result, a state of civil war essentially existed within his kingdom throughout much of the 1170s and 1180s, but perhaps most significantly, his clash with Thomas Becket and the murder of an Archbishop of Canterbury during his reign stands considerably against him. For these reasons, we might say that Henry II was an enigmatic ruler, a king who aspired to greatness and whose reputation was irrevocably tarnished by one or two key failings. What do you think of King Henry II? Was he one of England's greatest kings, or other aspects of his reign, most notably his clash with Thomas Becket, which tarnish him beyond repair? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. Hello guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoy our work and would like to support the channel, please visit our revamped Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee membership pages, which contain rewards such as early access to our content, merchandise discounts, and audio versions of our videos, along with much more that we give to our valued supporters. If you have not yet signed up to help our cause, we'd like to ask you to please consider doing so, as we need to secure the channel by safeguarding it from possible demonetization. To also invest in better equipment, software, and more people to help us improve our videos going forward. In short, without your contributions, these videos would not be possible. So if you would like to ensure this channel never has to shut down due to demonetization, please spare whatever you can per month and become People Profiles patrons. Thanks for listening.